If I were to say, how are you doing today? The answer would probably be good. But if I were to just tweak that question a little bit and say, how are you feeling today? Safe and secure? I'm not sure that the answer would be as confident. And it's not surprising, because if you meet a large group of people who are talking about the digital world and they say they feel safe and secure, you have to admire their innocence, but not necessarily how clued on they are with what's happening today. Given the relentless pace at which digital technologies are overtaking every aspect of our life, it sometimes becomes necessary to take a pause and look at all the implications of this. And one of the things that the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, who took office in 2014, is fond of saying is that he has met a number of global leaders, and in the last 2 years that he has been in office, 1.5 actually, a little more than 1.5, he has probably met a very large number of global leaders. He's met every single major leader across the world. And he often says that I have asked each of them, what is it that keeps you awake at night? And every one of the major countries, the number one issue was cybersecurity. So when the heads of state and heads of government say that, then it's probably time to worry. And so the reality today is that as the digitalization of societies, businesses, and governments are taking place at an incredible pace, driven by the ability of technology to make life infinitely more convenient and more efficient. At the same time, the reality of security threats are visible every day. And now many of them are reaching proportions where they attract global attention, whether it is the Apple court battle in the US, or whether it is issues relating to the use of social media in some countries to support a revolution or to fight a dictatorship, or breaches like the Snowden revelations and so on. Any and every one of these are now instant news across the world. And these issues of security and privacy, and we heard Tobias a little while ago sharing the trade-offs, if you like, although that was perhaps not the way in which it was looked at, that these are beginning to impact businesses and even international relations. But in a sense, for the industry, every challenge is an opportunity, and so also this one. The challenges that are coming up do present new kinds of opportunities. And if you look at the numbers and the frenetic pace at which the digitization is happening across the world, just look at the explosive growth in terms of the number of internet users or internet penetration or the size of the public cloud market. And if you look at the newest kid on the block, which is the IoT, and more devices getting connected, and by 2020 the projections are that it will be more than 20 billion such connected devices, and the size of the market also growing. But all of these have implications from a point of view of security. And just to present to you a comparative picture of India, in India there's been tremendous growth of the internet, especially in the last 3 years. In the last 1 year, more than 100 million people were added, which is at least twice as fast as the previous 100 million. And by 2020, we expect that it would be as many as 600 million people. So like in the rest of the world, the pace in India also has been pretty accelerated. And the IoT industry, while it was almost negligible in size in 2015, by 2020, we expect that it would be as much as $15 billion. I just want to draw your attention to some of the issues regarding the technology ecosystem. I don't intend to talk too much about technology, but it does have some implications for the kind of issues that we are talking about. And if you look at these trends, all the new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence or robotics or IoT or SMAC, every third day you see a new technology which is becoming quite prevalent. And each of these has implications. The age of hyper-specialization, where you have robotic processes and business process automation seamlessly linking people and machinery, people and equipment. And the separation between the physical and the cyber is no longer as clear as it once was. And governments themselves are pursuing agendas which are actually accelerating this space. In India, for example, the new government has made digital an article of faith. It is being seen as a great way to leapfrog in terms of accelerating the pace of economic development. And a country like India, which is not that developed, like many of the developed countries, needs to grow at an accelerated pace. And technology is the mantra which the government has sworn by. And using that for inclusion or in the society. I've talked about the convergence of physical, digital, but also increasingly even the biological sector, the kind of linkages that are being built in, the way in which they are getting seamlessly integrated is a part of the industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution that we are seeing, which is building on the earlier revolutions as well as electronics and IT. And increasingly, we find that all the core business processes are getting digitized. And these implications would have to be factored in. A lot of these are being propelled by data-driven technologies, which are increasing the capability and the speed of collecting data. When you look at Internet of Things and 20 billion devices getting connected by 2020, which is going to be 3 times the number of people on this planet. So it's not just people getting connected and generating data in the process. It's 3 times that number of devices by 2020 and increasing exponentially. And although many people talk fast, devices can talk much, much faster. So the amount of data which is actually getting created is also growing exponentially. And it's conveying information. And much of this information can actually, in a sense, impinge on privacy of individuals. And we've seen examples of all of that where these trade-offs are there. Location services which provide all the conveniences of an Uber or a home delivery of food also is sharing a part of information which you might otherwise have regarded as private. So there are a lot of these technologies. I won't go into the details, but these data-driven technologies, I believe, are a part of the ecosystem which is leading to not only great convenience and rapid growth, but also some of the concerns that we are talking about. If you look at the opportunities that digitization provides, I'm not talking about the security part per se, but it's important to understand how powerful these forces are from an economic point of view before we come to the security aspect. According to a study by McKinsey, the global economic impact of IT by 2025 would be of the order of $10 to $20 trillion. And the impact of IoT by 2025 would be of the order of $3.9 to $11 trillion. And if you look at the market for technology and business-enabled services, that would be of the order of $1.5 to $1.6 trillion. Just to give you a sense of proportion, India's own IT industry is currently around $150 billion. And by 2025, we expect it to be at the level of $350 billion. So as this progression is happening, we look at some of the impediments to this march. One big area is cybercrime, and every one of us who uses the internet for banking or mobile banking can't help but worry as to how safe it is. And every once in a while you come across somebody who has actually had an unfortunate experience. It may have been because of their carelessness, or it may have been for reasons beyond that. But either way, we all know that we are not secure. The losses are estimated at $3.7 to $6.9 trillion, and the banking industry loss is up to $1.3 trillion. Then you look at not just crime, but also cyber attacks, and the kind of attacks on major institutions, on defense installations, on defense targets. We've faced some of that in India as well, and the Indian Navy was targeted. And the use of technology is increasingly common by terror and terrorist groups. And in fact, it was extensively used in the 26/11 attacks in Mumbai. And some of these are, in fact, targeting critical infrastructure, which means that they now have the ability, precisely because of the level of digitization, to cripple a nation instantly without a single shot being fired. And some of these attacks we have seen. We had one such attack on the international airport at Delhi. And a number of malwares such as Stuxnet, Duku, Flame, these are all examples that we have seen which have actually rocked states. And the banks and the telecom sector in particular, which are heavily networked, have been the relentless target of many of these attacks. And we're also now increasingly seeing, on one side, the advent of drones, and on the other side, the hijacking of them, with no human beings involved at all, unlike aircraft. Then we look at cyber espionage, and where economic, military, and state secrets are stolen, and loss of IPRs, complex malware, cyber warfare where whole countries have been attacked, and social media spawning newer kinds of crimes. So all these different variants of security threats are, I think, a cause for deep concern, and these pose impediments to the march of digital technologies. The security attack ecosystem is also getting more and more sophisticated. Again, for want of time, I'll not go into all the details, but it's very focused now. It's not just random targets, not hit anyone, get anything you can, very focused. It's getting sophisticated, more sophisticated, and the impact is pretty dynamic. Execution is now commoditized. You can get anything you need to attack right off the shelf, which means that it's not something which is terribly difficult. It's a question of whether you set your mind to it or not. We've seen, I think this was mentioned earlier, state and non-state actors. And we've seen global supply chains being impacted. The other thing is the costs are coming down. Not only is it becoming easier, it's becoming cheaper, it's becoming faster to create these threats. And the quantity of information that is being exchanged is of a tremendous volume, and that is also attracting more and more such attacks. If you look at the kind of stories that emanate, every day we see new stories, whether it is in the area of health information systems or financial systems or in the mobile telephony. All of these, I think, have heightened the concerns of privacy. If you look at how governments are responding to this, these are all the factors that are propelling governments, that are forcing governments to respond. How do you restrict, how do you bring about a system of crime and punishment in this space? How do you ensure that the liabilities are enforceable? How do you ensure that the law covers all of these areas? And the fact that many of these problems are so prevalent is forcing governments to look at these issues. But it's also going beyond the boundaries. Laws, by definition, operate within the sovereign territory. But increasingly, the nature of issues is such that it goes across the boundaries and has an impact on foreign policy or bilateral and multilateral relations, and is raising questions regarding the way the internet is governed. But if you look at how governments are reacting to this, because of some of the reasons that have been mentioned, and quite often, governments tend to look at security as a quintessentially governmental function. Private sector has no role in it. That's the normal view. And I can say that without being pejorative, because I was myself in the government for many years and I've seen it from that side as well. Security is always regarded as something which is quintessentially governmental. But this is an area where all the knowledge and the threats reside in the private sector. So how do you ensure that these kind of inconsistencies and knee-jerk reactions do not come in? And how do you actually pull all of these things together in such a way that the ecosystem, the regulatory environment is pragmatic and harmonized, and most importantly, there is a measure of international coordination. In many of these attacks, it transcends borders, and therefore, in the absence of international collaboration, most of these problems cannot be easily addressed. Sorry. If you look at the Indian industry, there's a fairly high degree of participation and involvement in cybersecurity today, and it is only an area which has recently come into focus and has become a major area of activity. I'll not spend too much time on the details here. If you look at the cybersecurity in general across the world, it's not only a big challenge but a huge opportunity for the industry. That's how it is perceived. And spending on cybersecurity is accounting for a higher and higher percentage. By 2025, it would be as much as 3.7% of all IT spending. And the global cybersecurity market would be as high as $187 billion by 2025. I'll just leave you with a little thought. This is not a commercial, but I thought that since I've come from India, I should share with you a little bit about the areas where India has some capabilities in cybersecurity and where we are trying to enhance it. And in fact, the Prime Minister had thrown a challenge to the industry when he addressed us at our Silver Jubilee function, 25 years of NASSCOM last year, where he challenged the industry to come up with a set of recommendations on how the industry could help not only India, but the world to be a safer and more secure place. And we have come up with certain recommendations which are now a work in progress at the final stage. And we believe that by 2025, the market opportunity for the Indian industry alone would be about $35 billion, which is about 10% of the global market. And the approach that we have followed is a combination of 4 dimensions: technology dimension, the industry growth dimension, the skills dimension, and policy and regulatory dimension in the government. And unless all of these 4 are harmonized, whether in the country or internationally, we believe that this problem would not be solvable. So I leave it at that and welcome any questions that you have on the.
Thank you very much, Shekhar. Are there any questions right now? There's one question here.
You have framed the challenge, I think, or identified the challenge, which is governments always feel their responsibility for security, but the industry finds itself, basically with all the skills and knowledge. So how are we going to move forward on that? Because that's the essential challenge to addressing this. And I guess it's not just industry as a whole. There are many sectors within industry that need to be integrated as well. So banking, finance, health, all of these different sectors that become targets.
Yeah, I think that clearly there is a problem in the area of government itself, because of the reasons, as I was mentioning, that governments are not accustomed by precedent or by practice to work closely with the industry in the area of security. The knowledge lies today almost entirely with the industry. There's very little comparatively inside the government. There are a few individuals, no doubt about it, but as a whole, much of this lies in the industry. If you take India as an example, you have about 10,000 professionals from this space in the government, and you have 3.7 million in the private sector. It's a no-brainer. But how you bring them together, how does the government re-establish a relationship, a new relationship of trust with the industry and work with them? I think this is something which we are yet to see really evolve. I think the other problem is comparatively easier to solve, like you said about banking or telecom, because quite often we have private industry in those areas operating the facilities, even if they are public utilities. So there, I think they are more attuned to working with the industry. And I don't think that there the problem will be as acute, because it's not a question of change of the culture, but it's a question of being more willing to share where you see the threats and overcoming the resistance to share where you are vulnerable. But as the economic impact of those breaches goes up, then the private sector will do what the private sector does. How do you cut the losses? So I see that collaboration happening almost certainly. But with the government, as the awareness grows, we hope things will change.
Thank you. One more question.
Chandrashekhar, good to see you again in Australia, and repeating the point that Rob has made, good friends between AWI and NASSCOM. My question for you is, this is moving at such a fast pace, and if you look at it, maybe just 5 years ago, this is not such an emerging issue. This is now a here and now issue. Certainly, in different countries, they address it differently. In Australia, there seems to be a bit of a vacuum, and I just would like very much your thoughts about how you do it in India, where, as you said, the government has a role to play. The expertise seems to be in the private sector, and each one of those players in the private sector have an ability in-house to look after themselves. So how does NASSCOM, or if it's not NASSCOM, another body of sorts that bring together all the stakeholders who are not necessarily just around the technology industry. There are people who are in the risk management industry, people who are in the insurance industry, people who are in the legal industry. All these things need to come together to form a united, well thought through a response to what is now a really, really here and now and severe problem that everyone faces. So, question: what's NASSCOM role in this, and what is, if not NASSCOM, a body that brings it all together, where all the stakeholders can work together, and there's a central point of reference for cybersecurity in India?
I do believe that the government has a very, very important role in actually bringing together those players, and that is something which actually can only be done by the government. But it has to be preceded by an awareness of the magnitude of the problem, the scale of economic impact that it can have or economic damage that it can do to the country, as well as the scale of security vulnerability that it can create. In all of security, and I have worked in the area of security long before the internet actually came in, so I'm aware that all security in the government is looked at from the point of view of threat perception. If the threat perception is not high, then the security arrangements are not that high. But if the threat perception is high, then they are scaled up accordingly. So today, as the threat levels are going up, I think governments react more quickly and more intensively when the threat is from a security in a physical sense, rather than the industry, which is like banking or telecom, where the commercial implications of these threats are responded to much faster. So putting these two together and creating an environment in which organizations and industry which has the skills and the technology actually addresses the areas most critical to the country. You cannot address all the areas. All of us know that there is nothing like perfect security. But how do you prioritize and how much of security do you provide? That is a thinking, I think, which has to be done by the government, by the industry in the various domains, and by the technology service providers. Bringing them together, I think, is something which the government needs to do, and the industry can actually help in doing that. That's what NASSCOM is doing in India. Fortunately, like in the case of Australia, we have a Prime Minister who's very knowledgeable, or at least who's very aware of all these issues. And that's the reason why he asked us to start this process. And that's what we are doing. And I'm sure, given the fact that you had the Prime Minister here as your guest last year, you should have no difficulty in taking back the same message. That's what I would guess.
What a lovely note to finish the talk on. Thank you, Mr. Chandrashekhar.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.